September 27, 1941, Soviet Union, Kalinin Front. Senior Lieutenant Boris Kovzan had run out of ammunition. His Polikarpov Und-16 fighter had expended every bullet, every cannon shell. The guns were silent. Useless. But the German bomber ahead of him, a Heinkel He-111, was still airborne, still heading towards Soviet positions, still carrying bombs that could kill his comrades. Kovzan had a choice: return to base, land safely, rearm, come back later. That was what doctrine, training, and common sense dictated. Or he could do something else, something insane, something no pilot should ever consider. He could ram the bomber, use his aircraft as a weapon, trade his life for the kill. But Kovzan didn't intend to die. He'd done it before, 3 times, rammed 3 German aircraft, and survived all 3. This would be his 4th, what the Germans called taran, what the Soviets called necessary, what everyone else called suicide. Kovzan pushed the throttle forward. His I-16 surged ahead. The wooden propeller spun faster. He aimed for the Heinkel's tail, the most vulnerable part. If he hit it right, the bomber would lose control. It would crash. And maybe, just maybe, Kovzan would survive. At 400 meters, the German rear gunner saw him, opened fire. Tracers streaked past Kovzan's canopy. 1 bullet tore through the windscreen, missing his head by inches. Kovzan didn't flinch. He didn't deviate. His course was locked onto the target. At 200 meters, the German pilot noticed him, tried to turn. Too late, too slow. The Heinkel was a bomber designed for payload, not agility. It couldn't evade. At 100 meters, Kovzan braced. His grip tightened on the stick. His harness dug into his chest. And then, he rammed. The impact was devastating. The I-16's propeller tore into the Heinkel's tail. Metal screamed. Wood splintered. The bomber's vertical stabilizer was torn away. The rudder sheared off. The Heinkel spiraled down uncontrollably. The crew had seconds to bail out. Most didn't make it. Kovzan's I-16 shuddered violently. The propeller was gone. The engine screamed, then died. The nose was crushed. The windscreen shattered. But the wings held. The fuselage held. Kovzan was alive. And his aircraft, barely, was still flying. He had no engine, no propeller, no ammunition. But he still had altitude and skill. Kovzan turned the I-16 into a glider. He angled the nose downward, searching for anywhere to land. A field, a road, anything flat. He found a clearing, 2 kilometers away, gliding toward it. Silent. The only sound was the wind rushing past the shattered cockpit. At 50 meters, he manually lowered the landing gear. The hydraulics were dead. Everything else was dead. Except him. The I-16 hit the ground hard, bounced, skidded. The undercarriage collapsed. The fuselage scraped across frozen dirt. Sparks flew. Metal ground against metal. Then, it stopped. Kovzan unbuckled, climbed out, surveyed his aircraft. The nose was destroyed. The propeller was gone. The engine cracked, but the wings were intact. The fuselage could be repaired. He had survived his 4th ramming. What no other pilot had done, what everyone had said was impossible. And 3 months later, he did it again. Because that's what Boris Kovzan did. When the guns were empty, he became the weapon. When retreat made sense, he attacked. When survival seemed impossible, he survived. This is the story of the fighter pilot who rammed 4 German aircraft and lived to tell the tale. Every single time. Who was Boris Kovzan? Boris Ivanovich. Kovzan was born in 1922 in a small village nestled in the Ural Mountains. His father, a mechanic, worked on tractors, trucks, and anything with an engine. Young Boris grew up in the workshop, learning how machines worked, how they broke, and how to fix them. By the age of 12, he could disassemble an engine and rebuild it from memory. At 16, a local aviation club opened nearby. Soviet propaganda was all about aviation. "Youth to the skies," the posters proclaimed. Boris immediately enrolled, not because of propaganda, but because he loved machines. Aircraft, in particular, were the most complex machines he had ever seen. He began his flying lessons in a Polikarpov Po-2, a slow, stable, forgiving biplane trainer, perfect for beginners. Boris soloed after only 8 hours. His instructor wrote, "Natural feel for aircraft, excellent spatial awareness, recommended for fighter training." In 1939, at 17, Boris entered military flight school. The Soviet Union was preparing for war. Germany was rearming and expanding. The question wasn't if the war would start, but when. Boris trained on the Polikarpov I-16, small, fast, maneuverable, and unforgiving. Many students crashed, but not Boris. He mastered the I-16, learning its quirks, how to push it to its limits without going over the edge. By 1941, Boris had been assigned to the 402nd Fighter Aviation Regiment, stationed near the border with German-occupied Poland. His job: intercept German bombers, protect Soviet ground forces, and survive. On June 22, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. 3 million German soldiers, thousands of tanks and aircraft, the largest invasion in history. The Soviet Air Force was caught off guard, wiped out within hours. Entire regiments destroyed before they could even take off. Boris's regiment survived, barely. They fought westward, engaging German formations. Outnumbered, outgunned, Soviet pilots were inexperienced in combat. But they learned quickly. In the first week, Boris shot down 2 German aircraft, a Messerschmitt Bf-109 and a Junkers Ju-87 Stuka. Both kills were confirmed. His commander noted Boris's aggression and willingness to attack, even when outnumbered. But Boris noticed something troubling. Soviet fighters were running out of ammunition faster than they could rearm. Air bases were being overrun. Supply lines were cut. Sometimes he would take off with only half the usual ammunition, sometimes less. And the Germans kept coming. Bombers, fighters, endless. On August 15, 1941, Boris intercepted a formation of 5 German bombers, Heinkel He-111s, escorted by Bf-109s. He shot down 1 bomber, damaged another, but then his guns jammed. Both machine guns, both cannons. A mechanical failure, common with the I-16. The guns overheated. The ammo feed jammed. Boris was defenseless, but the bomber was still flying, still dropping bombs. Soviet troops were below, retreating. If those bombs hit, dozens would die. Hundreds. Boris made a decision. He rammed, his first ramming. He aimed at the bomber's tail, hit it. The Heinkel went down. Boris's I-16 was damaged, but still flyable. He glided back to base and landed. His commander was furious. "You could have died," Boris calmly replied. "But I didn't, and the bomber did." The Soviet Air Force had a name for this tactic: taran, a deliberate ramming attack, rare, desperate, often fatal. But sometimes it worked, and Boris had proven he could do it, and survive. On September 27, 1941, Boris rammed again, his 4th ramming. This time, the entire regiment knew. Word spread. Other pilots began asking, "How do you survive?" Boris's answer was simple. Aim for the tail, hit it with your propeller, pull away immediately, glide to safety. It sounded simple, but it wasn't. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, you miss. Too late, you die. The angle had to be precise. Too steep, your aircraft would disintegrate. Too shallow, you bounce off. And you had to accept that you might die. Every time. But Boris didn't just accept the risk. He calculated it, studied it, learned from each ramming. By his fourth, he had refined the tactic. Turned suicide into survival. What everyone said was impossible. Boris made repeatable. The aircraft that became a weapon. The Polikarpov IL-16 was never designed for ramming. It was created in 1933 as a modern fighter, fast, maneuverable, and revolutionary for its time. The world's first low-wing monoplane fighter with retractable landing gear. When it entered service in 1934, it was ahead of every other fighter in the world. But by 1941, it had become obsolete. The Luftwaffe's Messerschmitt Bf-109 was faster, better armed, and more modern. The I-16 was outclassed. Yet, it was what the Soviet Air Force had. Thousands of them. And pilots like Boris Kovzan learned to use every advantage the I-16 offered. The I-16 was small, compact. Its fuselage was mostly wood, and the wings were fabric stretched over a metal frame. The M62 radial engine was powerful, but unreliable. The armament varied. Some I-16s had 2 machine guns, some 2 cannons, and others both. Boris's I-16 had 2 Shkayaz 7.16mm machine guns and 2 Shvak 20mm cannons, when they worked. The I-16's greatest strength wasn't speed or firepower, it was maneuverability. The aircraft could turn tighter than almost anything in the sky. At low speeds, it was deadly in a dogfight. Luftwaffe pilots learned to avoid turning battles with the I-16. They preferred speed, altitude, and boom and zoom tactics. Dive, shoot, climb, never turning. But Boris didn't always get to choose the engagement. Sometimes, the Germans had the upper hand. Altitude, speed, numbers. When that happened, Boris improvised. And for Boris, improvisation often meant ramming. The I-16's wooden construction was both a weakness and a strength. Wood was lighter than metal and easier to repair, but it was also fragile. A single 20mm cannon hit could tear off a wing. Yet, in a ramming attack, wood was forgiving. It absorbed the impact, splintering instead of shattering. Metal would crumple. Wood would break, but hold together. Just enough for Boris to glide home. The M62 radial engine was another advantage. Radial engines were tough and reliable, able to withstand damage and keep running. Sometimes. When Boris rammed, the propeller would be destroyed, the engine damaged. But the engine block itself, solid metal, heavy, and durable, acted as a battering ram. It transferred the impact through the airframe. If Boris hit at the right angle, the engine absorbed most of the shock, allowing the fuselage to survive. And Boris to survive. But survival wasn't just about luck. It required understanding the aircraft. Boris knew the I-16's limits, where it was strong and where it was weak. He knew the wings could handle stress. The tail could not. He knew the landing gear was fragile and would collapse on rough landings. He knew the fuel tank was located in the fuselage, behind the cockpit. If it ruptured, he'd burn. So he aimed carefully, always hitting with the nose. Never the wings, never the fuselage center. And he knew one other thing. The I-16 was expendable. The Soviet Union was producing new fighters, Yak-1s, LeGG-3s, MiG-3s, modern designs, better aircraft. But they weren't ready yet, not in large numbers. So pilots like Boris flew the I-16. And when the I-16 couldn't shoot down the enemy, Boris turned it into a weapon. The second ramming. October 12, 1941. 2 weeks after his fourth ramming, Boris was back in the air, flying a new I-16. His previous one was being repaired. This one had less ammunition. 40 rounds per cannon, 100 rounds per machine gun. Enough for maybe 30 seconds of firing. Then, nothing. The target was a German bomber formation, 4 Dornier Do 17s, flying toward Soviet positions near Kalinin. Boris's squadron, 6 I-16s, climbed to intercept, but they were intercepted first by 8 Bf-109s. The dogfight started at 4,000 meters. Within minutes, 2 Soviet fighters were down. The rest scattered. Boris found himself alone. Again. But the Dorniers were still there, still heading toward their target. Boris climbed, got above them, and dove. Fired. Hit one Dornier. Smoke poured out, but it kept flying. Fired again. Hit another. This one dropped out of formation. Started descending. Good. But the other 3 kept going, and Boris was out of ammunition. All guns empty. He looked at the lead Dornier 300 meters ahead. Steady course, straight and level. An easy target, if he had ammunition. But he didn't. He had one option. Ramming. Boris pushed the throttle, accelerated, closing the distance. The Dornier's rear gunner saw him coming. Opened fire. Bullets hit Boris's I-16. One shattered the canopy. Glass scattered. Another hit the wing, punching a hole. But it didn't stop him. Boris kept coming. At 100 meters, the Dornier tried to turn. Too late. Boris aimed for the vertical stabilizer, the tail fin. Hit it. The impact was massive. The I-16's propeller ripped through the Dornier's tail. The bomber's rudder separated. The elevator bent. The Dornier pitched down, uncontrollable. The crew bailed out. 3 parachutes opened. The Dornier crashed into a forest. Boris's I-16 was worse off than before. The propeller was completely gone. The engine made horrible sounds. Then it stopped. Dead. But Boris still had altitude. 3,500 meters. Enough to glide. He found a field, lined up and glided in. No engine, no power, just momentum and gravity. He landed hard. The landing gear collapsed. The I-16 skidded on its belly, stopped in a plowed field. Mud everywhere. Boris climbed out, unhurt. Again. 2 rammings. 2 survivals. His regiment commander was waiting when he returned to base. Kovzan, you can't keep doing this. Boris replied. Why not? It works. The psychology of ramming. What makes a pilot ram an enemy aircraft? Desperation, courage, patriotism. All of these. But also something else. Calculation. Boris Kovzan wasn't suicidal. He was pragmatic. He calculated the odds, and he believed he could survive because he had before. Soviet propaganda glorified Taran. Posters depicted heroic pilots sacrificing themselves to destroy the enemy. Radio broadcasts told stories of pilots ramming German bombers, dying for the motherland, the ultimate sacrifice. Stalin himself praised Taran pilots, calling them heroes. But Boris didn't ram for propaganda. He rammed because it worked. It was effective. The alternative, letting the bomber through, meant Soviet soldiers would die. And Boris calculated that his life was more valuable alive than dead. So, he rammed. And he survived. Other pilots tried to imitate Boris. Few succeeded. Most died. Because ramming required more than just courage. It required precision, timing, and an understanding of physics, of aircraft structures, angles, speeds, and distances. Most pilots didn't have that understanding. Boris did. He learned from every ramming. After his first, he realized, hit too high, and your aircraft flips. Hit too low, and you strike the fuselage, which is stronger. You die. Hit the tail. It's weak. The enemy loses control. You might survive. After his second ramming, he learned. Pull away immediately. Don't stay engaged. The moment of impact, pull back on the stick. Get separation. Otherwise, you get tangled, locked together, and both go down. After his third ramming, of which I'll tell you in a moment, he learned. Protect the cockpit. Use the engine as a shield. The engine absorbs the impact. The cockpit stays intact. You stay alive. And after his fourth ramming, he learned. Aim for glide distance. Don't ram at low altitude. You need altitude to glide home, at least 2,000 meters, preferably more. That gives you options. Fields, roads, anywhere flat. These weren't instincts. They were calculations, lessons, refined technique. Boris was turning ramming, a desperate tactic, into a repeatable skill. And that terrified the Luftwaffe. The third ramming, November 4th, 1941. Boris's squadron was ordered to escort Soviet bombers, the Ilyushin Il-4s. Slow, vulnerable. Their mission, bombing German positions near Kalinin. The escort, 6 I-16s, including Boris. The mission went wrong immediately. German fighters, Bf-109s, intercepted before the bombers could reach their target. The dogfight was chaotic. Soviet fighters tried to protect the bombers, but they were outnumbered. 2 I-16s were shot down within the first minute. The Il-4s scattered, trying to escape, but one Il-4 was hit. Its engine smoking, it began descending. The crew was trying to reach Soviet lines, but a Bf-109 was on their tail, lining up for the kill. Boris saw it. Dove chased the 109, fired, missed. The 109 was fast and evasive. Boris fired again, hit the wing, but it wasn't enough. The 109 kept chasing the damaged Il-4, and Boris was out of ammunition, again. But the Il-4 crew were his people, Soviet airmen. If they died, it would be his failure. Boris made the decision. He rammed the 109. Not the ideal target. Fighters were smaller, faster, and harder to hit. But Boris had no choice. He accelerated. The 109 pilot saw him coming, tried to evade, rolled right. But Boris anticipated, turned inside, closed the distance, and hit. The impact was different, smaller. The 109 was lighter than a bomber, less mass. The collision was sharp, violent, but quick. The 109's tail ripped off. The fighter spun, inverted, the pilot bailed, parachute opened. He survived. Boris's I-16 was heavily damaged, worse than before. The propeller was gone. The engine was on fire, flames licking back toward the cockpit. Boris shut off the fuel. Dove, using speed to blow out the fire. It worked. Mostly. The engine was dead, but the fire was out. He glided, found a road, and landed. The I-16 skidded, stopped. Boris climbed out, burned hands, singed flight suit, but alive. 3 rammings, 3 survivals. The Il-4 crew made it back. They reported, "Kovzan saved us. He rammed a 109. We saw it. He's insane." The regiment commander agreed. But he also pinned a medal on Boris's chest. Order of the Red Banner. For courage, for skill, for surviving the unsurvivable. The doctrine of taran. The Soviet Air Force didn't officially teach ramming, but they didn't discourage it either. In 1941, Soviet fighters were losing badly. The Luftwaffe was destroying hundreds of Soviet aircraft every week. Desperation led to innovation. And ramming, taran, became part of Soviet tactics. The first recorded taran of World War II took place on June 22, 1941, the first day of the invasion. Lieutenant Ivan Ivanov rammed a German bomber near the border. He died, but the bomber crashed. Stalin heard about it, praised Ivanov, and called him a hero. Propaganda spread the story. Other pilots followed. By the end of 1941, over 200 Soviet pilots had attempted taran. Most died, but some survived. Boris Kovzan was among them. His repeated survivals made him something more, a teacher. Other pilots asked, "How do you do it?" Boris showed them, explained the technique, the angles, the timing, and the escape. But he also warned them, don't do it unless you have no choice. Ramming is a last resort, not the first option. Use your guns, use your tactics. Only ram when nothing else works. Some listened, some didn't. The ones who didn't died. By 1942, the Soviet Air Force had new fighters, Yak-1s, Yak-9s, La-5s. Better aircraft, with better guns and more ammunition. Ramming became rarer, but it didn't stop. Sometimes the guns jammed. Sometimes the ammunition ran out. And sometimes ramming was still the only option. Boris flew Yak fighters in 1942. Faster, more powerful. He shot down more German aircraft. Officially, his tally reached 28 kills. But 4 of those were rammings, including his 5th, his final ramming, on February 13th, 1943. The 5th ramming, February 13th, 1943. Boris was flying a Yak-1, escorting Soviet ground attack aircraft, the Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmoviks, heavily armored, deadly against tanks, but vulnerable to fighters. Boris's job, keep German fighters away. The mission was routine, until it wasn't. A formation of Focke-Wulf FW-190s appeared, 6 of them. New German fighters, fast, well-armed, and dangerous. They dove on the Il-2s. Boris and his wingman intercepted. The dogfight started at 3,000 meters and quickly descended to 500 meters, low, fast, and chaotic. Boris shot down 1 FW-190. His wingman got another. But Boris's guns jammed. Both Shvak 20mm cannons overheated and stopped firing. 1 FW-190 lined up on an Il-2. The Sturmovik pilot tried to evade, but the Il-2 was slow, and the FW-190 was closing in fast. Boris didn't hesitate. He rammed, his 5th ramming, this time in a Yak-1, faster and heavier than the I-16, with more momentum. He aimed for the FW-190's tail. The impact was catastrophic. The FW-190's entire tail section separated. The fighter spun, crashed, and the pilot didn't bail. Boris's Yak-1 was destroyed. The propeller was gone. The engine was broken. The cowling ripped off. But the wings held. The fuselage held. And Boris had enough altitude, just barely, 400 meters. He glided, found a field, and crash-landed. The Yak-1 hit hard. The landing gear collapsed. The aircraft flipped and inverted. Boris hung upside down in his harness, dazed but alive. Soviet ground forces found him, pulling him from the wreckage. He had a concussion, broken ribs, burns. But he was alive. 5 rammings. 5 survivals. What no other pilot in history had done. What everyone said was impossible. Boris Kovzan had done it 5 times. The aftermath, Boris Kovzan survived the war. He continued flying until 1944, by which time he had 28 confirmed kills, 4 by ramming, the rest by gunfire. He was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor. The medal was pinned on his chest by a general who said, "You are either the bravest pilot in the Soviet Union or the craziest, probably both." After the war, Boris became a test pilot, testing new Soviet fighters, jets like the MiG-15 and MiG-17, fast, modern, nothing like the I-16. He flew until 1960, then retired and became an instructor, teaching young pilots, not how to ram, but how to fly, how to survive, and how to think. Students would ask, "Is it true you rammed 5 aircraft?" Boris would nod. "Is it true you survived all 5? Boris would smile. "Obviously, I'm here." But he would also warn them, ramming is not heroic, it's desperate. Don't do it unless you have no other option. Use your guns, use your brain, stay alive. Dead heroes don't win wars. Living pilots do. Boris Kovzan passed away in 1985 at age 63 from natural causes. The legacy of taran ramming attacks, taran, were rare in World War II. The Soviet Air Force recorded approximately 600 taran attacks during the war. Most were fatal. Of those 600, only about 30 pilots survived, and only one pilot survived 5 rammings, Boris Kovzan. The Luftwaffe feared taran. German pilots called it the Russian madness. They couldn't understand it. Why would a pilot deliberately destroy his own aircraft? The answer: because it worked. One destroyed Soviet fighter could take down a German bomber, a bomber that cost more, carried more crew, and delivered more destruction. The math was simple. 1 I-16 for 1, he 111. Acceptable trade. If the pilot survived, even better. But ramming wasn't madness. It was doctrine. The Soviet Air Force studied taran, analyzed successes and failures, published guidelines, and taught techniques, not officially, but informally. Pilots like Boris Kovzan shared their knowledge, passing down the lessons: how to aim, when to pull away, where to hit. After the war, ramming became obsolete. Modern fighters had more ammunition, better guns and missiles. Ramming was no longer necessary, but the legacy remained. Soviet pilots who survived taran were honored. Veterans, heroes, living proof that the impossible could become possible if you were willing to try. Today, military aviation schools study taran, not to teach it, but to understand it. The psychology, the physics, the desperation, the courage, and the calculation. Because taran wasn't about dying for your country. It was about making the enemy die for theirs and surviving to fight another day. Boris Kovzan proved that. 5 times. The pilot who became a weapon. There's a monument in Kalinin, now called Tver. A statue of a Soviet pilot stands beside an I-16 fighter. The plaque reads, "To the pilots who defended the motherland, who gave everything, who feared nothing." Boris Kovzan's name is on that plaque, alongside dozens of others. Pilots who flew the I-16, who fought against impossible odds, who survived or didn't. But Boris's story is different. He didn't just fight. He innovated. He turned his aircraft into a weapon when the guns failed. He rammed. Not once, not twice, but 5 times. And he survived. Every single time. That's not luck. That's skill. That's understanding. That's the refusal to accept defeat. Even when defeat seemed certain. Even when the guns were empty. Even when the enemy had every advantage. You find a way. You improvise. You attack. Boris Kovzan attacked, with bullets, with cannons, and when those failed, with his entire aircraft. He turned the I-16 from fighter into battering ram, and he survived. Because he calculated, because he learned, because he refused to die. On February 13th, 1943, after his 5th ramming, Boris climbed out of his wrecked Yak-1, looked at the burning WW-190, glanced at his destroyed aircraft, and smiled. Because he was alive. Again. And the enemy was dead. Again. A Soviet soldier asked. "How many times have you done that?" Boris replied. "Too many." The soldier laughed. "You're insane." Boris shook his head. "No. Just stubborn." Stubborn. That's what Boris Kovzan was. Stubborn enough to ram 5 aircraft. Stubborn enough to survive 5 rammings. Stubborn enough to prove that impossible was just another word for hasn't been done yet. This is the story of the fighter pilot who rammed 5 German aircraft, who survived every single ramming, who turned desperation into technique, who became a legend. Boris Kovzan, the pilot who became a weapon and lived to tell about it.